Я предоставляю слово человеку, который своей яркой, харизматичной, из неизвестного источника идущей энергией должен завершить сегодня наше мероприятие и подвести итоги, и подготовить нас всех к банкету. Профессор Стив Фуллер. Давайте поприветствуем его снова и дадим слово.
How much time do you want me to speak? You just name the number.
15 minutes maximum plus questions and comments.
Okay.
Including or plus?
Plus.
So they come after the 15 minutes.
You want it during the 15 minutes?
Dr. Fuller,
Yes.
improvise.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much. And I guess the first thing I want to say, keeping in mind the time, is that there is an enormous opportunity here with developing science and technology studies, because in a sense we live in an STS-shaped world, okay? So regardless of what one makes of the particular theoretical commitments and so forth that's attached to the field of STS, the fact of the matter is that the world presents itself in an STS-like fashion. So in particular, various kinds of distinctions that used to be very important in organizing society, including human, non-human. One may talk about the difference, so the concept of governance came up yesterday. That concept is a result of the idea of the state losing kind of a clear sense of what its boundaries are, and there being other forms of control and governance in the world. Now these are not things that STS created, contrary to what some of its critics would say, but nevertheless STS is in a very good conceptual and empirical position to reflect this kind of emerging reality, which in many respects is something that's come over the course of my academic career. So as it were, the apparent nature of the STS analysis, the fact that the STS analysis seems kind of obvious now sometimes, or intuitive now, wasn't present 30, 40 years ago, where a lot of these boundaries were still quite clear. And of course, one of the most important boundaries has been the boundary between science and technology and society. And those boundaries have been largely erased or undermined in all kinds of ways. Okay? And so even take something like expert authority. Again, this is not STS's fault, but with the advent of the internet, with the advent of making it much easier for people to find out alternative sources of authority and knowledge and so forth, that in itself creates a kind of crisis of expertise, which then STS, having a kind of open-minded attitude in principle toward these kinds of things, is able to then explore very well. So I think at the level of the kind of world in which we live, STS is very well adapted to this kind of world, instinctively. And so, one of the early moments in STS thinking that's associated with Latour is this business of opening black boxes. And in a sense, Latour didn't have to open the black boxes. All of society was opening up black boxes all along during the 1980s and 90s and so forth. But STS, in a way, was kind of on the scene, being conceptually ready for that. I think the real question, though, and this is one of the things that's kind of exciting coming to a place like this, is exactly how is STS to be institutionalized, right? In other words, what kind of a thing is STS? Because I think at the moment, again, if you were doing kind of an empirical analysis of what STS is as a kind of social intellectual formation, you would say it is a kind of collection of methods, okay, in a way very much biased in the direction of sort of ethnographic methods, and it's a kind of a, you might say, tries to operate with relatively few theoretical commitments. So for example, in this respect, STS is very clearly, even though STS, you might say, in some sense demystifies a lot of taken for granted views about science and society, it doesn't do it from a kind of heavy theoretical standpoint the way in which, let's say, maybe Marxists or somebody like this would do. So there's a kind of theory lightness, you might say, to STS, which makes it, in fact, very nimble. It can move in many different places because it doesn't carry a lot of ideological baggage of its own. You know, so as a result, it can easily take on everybody else's ideological baggage, which makes STS a very useful field. And so it really has a lot of relevance in many different policy settings, and in a sense, being trained in STS, you can actually get jobs. Perhaps short-term contract jobs, but you can get jobs. I think the interesting question, though, is what does STS mean, you might say, in academic terms or in terms of some kind of long-term project? Okay? Elena, earlier today, was alluding to the history of the Office of Technology Assessment in the United States, which disappeared in the late 1990s. And there, what you had were people who were influenced by a certain kind of STS vision, long, in a way, pre-Latourian, if you can believe there was a moment in STS like that, a kind of pre-Latourian vision of STS that actually had a kind of clear normative institutional role as producing critical policy relevant knowledge. That was kind of what the goal was back then, and this was an idea that was present in the 1970s, and kind of pretty much disappeared by the early 1990s, I think, as far as a force within STS proper. But this was kind of what it was about. And so the way the Office of Technology Assessment, which was basically the body that the United States Congress turned to get analyses of science and technology, whenever they wanted it, it got killed by two things. And these were two things that, in a sense, would normally be opposed to each other, but they were opposed to critical policy relevant knowledge. One was, I don't know if you recall, but in the early 1990s there was this great proposal to have the super collider being built in the United States. This would have been the largest particle accelerator in the world. It would be funded by the US government and it would be located under Texas. What happened was that what the OTA was asked to do was to actually figure out how important this was to the physics community, because a lot of Nobel Prize winners were talking it up. And Congress was kind of impressed by those guys. But some members were wondering because there was a tight budget issue and so forth. And so OTA had to come up with a methodology to figure out what physicists really think about this project. So they did it democratically. They asked each physicist, everyone who's registered with the American Physical Society, and they did surveys, very complex surveys of their views. And it turned out that the super collider was ranked something like third, and the argument against it was it wouldn't employ enough physicists. Right? It's a relatively elite kind of activity relative to all the things physicists do. And so the OTA presented its results, and it was used, other things were used, but it was used to kill the super collider. And there was a certain kind of view there that was embodied in the methodology, namely that all scientists are co-participators in the construction of science. It isn't just the elite guys talking down to everybody else. Okay? Now that's even compatible with the Mertonian view in some sense, perhaps, maybe. But the point is, the idea of taking literally the idea of science democratically and treating each person's view equally killed the super collider within the physics community. Forever, the elite scientific community hated the OTA on that basis. But then on the other hand, as we move into the 1990s, the OTA also starts to talk about greater environmental regulation on industrial innovation. Okay, so the business community is being slowed down with regard to what they can do. And that causes problems too. So you've got the business community and you've got the elite scientific community who normally are not too crazy about each other. Okay, they don't, because they have opposite views about science, but they all could agree that OTA was not doing any of them any favors. And so it was quite easy in the end, during another round of budget cutting, that there were so many complaints about this organization. Now the thing about the lesson here, the point I want to raise about this was an example of STS-inspired people doing kind of what was STS stuff in those days, but adopting an independent normative perspective, right? So in other words, they weren't just, they took their, in a way they kind of got their own point of view, and they were killed for it. Now STS doesn't have this problem anymore. If anything, STS is over-adaptive. Right? You can do STS on anything for anyone if the price is right. Right? Because the methods are really good. Nobody denies the methods are good. And as long as you're not traveling around with theoretical or ideological baggage, like Marxism or something like that, you can be employed by anyone. Okay? And STS people are employed by anyone. Okay? And so I do think for, insofar as we think about STS as in some sense a social formation of its own, right? What kind of a formation is it? Because it seems to me quite clearly that while people like myself, for example, when I started out in this field and started writing a lot about the STS, there seemed to me there were two kind of visions of what STS could be as a social formation. This goes back now 25 years. And in a way I conceptualized this sort of before we got to our neoliberal moment. Okay, because my thinking about STS actually sort of predates neoliberalism, which really only starts to kick in the late 80s, early 90s in a really self-evident kind of way. But if you go back 25 years, there was of course the idea of STS as an academic discipline. And so for those of you, and I guess I think you'd be the person who fit this the best, the people who think about the STS as challenging certain kinds of philosophical notions about the nature of science at the epistemological level. So when we talk about the debates about relativism and rationality, and things of that kind, and that in some sense, STS is kind of intervening in that kind of level, namely trying to come up with a kind of empirically adequate normative self-understanding of science. Okay? And so then it becomes very important to talk to the philosophers, right, and to be worried about whether the philosophers' views are the views that scientists hold, and all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of a very academic kind of STS, and in a sense I kind of came in that way, as trained in history and philosophy of science. Okay, and that's recognizable. The Edinburgh School, right, Barnes, Bloor, those guys, they talk only to philosophers, right? And of course, in a way, Harry Collins is kind of, in a way, still in that tradition, I would say. But of course there was this other view, and this was the view of, and it this other view didn't like the term science and technology studies, which is too academic. They liked science, technology, and society, right, the other STS. And those guys wanted it to be a kind of social movement. And very often these people were coming from scientific backgrounds, and they were, as it were, self-conscious scientists. Scientists who were very much concerned, and Ari, that's where you come from, isn't it, sort of? I mean, these are people who were very...
I'm a hybrid.
I know, we all are. No, but the thing is that concerned about the environmental damage that science and technology is causing, worried about the way in which science and technology is so heavily funded and directed by the military in various ways, right? All the nuclear issue, right? I mean, some of the things you were mentioning, pugwash, I think a couple of people have. In a way, science and technology, STS would have been a kind of more generalized, perhaps even globalized version of those kinds of movements that had already arisen within the scientific community in the post-war period. So scientists, in some sense, can take more active responsibility for the way in which the science and technology is being used. And it would be in that context that there would be need to get involved with, social scientists and socially concerned people and so forth, right? But the scientists were very much part of this kind of movement. And there is a hybrid work from the early 70s, if you want to, if you remember, he's still alive and still kicking around at Oxford, Jerome Ravitz. I don't know if this name means anything to anyone. Jerome Ravitz. Yeah, you'd remember. Yeah. Okay. Well, the thing is, he wrote this book in 1971, Scientific Knowledge and Its Social Problems. Right? And so Ravitz is a guy, like myself, who was trained in history and philosophy of science, but kind of was very much sensitized by all of these critical science movements that were going on. So this is in fact one of the first books to talk about intellectual property and research ethics and things of that kind. I think it's fair to say that while Ravitz over the years has had some influence, post-normal science, you may know that concept from him, but in terms of the general vision that was being outlined in the original book, it's had no impact in STS, as it now is understood. And in fact, when the book was reissued on its, I think, 30th anniversary or something, and the review of it in Social Studies of Science, written by Steve Shapin, right, one of the great historians in this field, really just dismissed it as some sort of 60s thing. I mean, that's kind of the tone of it. It was a very dismissive kind of thing. This is a book of the past, basically. This is of no relevance to us today, okay? And what happened, of course, is, when you move into the 1990s and into the period we're moving into now, STS more and more gets closely identified with various methods, with the methods. And a lot of the earlier theoretical debates kind of disappear. And so when we do talk about theoretical debates in STS, it's almost like a trip down memory lane. We're always talking about the stuff from the 70s and the 80s, right? But if we're talking about STS as it's conducted now, we're largely talking about the application of methods, or as I think was clear, Olga, from your talk, right? Certain kinds of concepts that get attached to bodies of data, right? Where the case is kind of really driving everything. Okay, and then the idea is what you can illuminate about the case, and the methods are quite helpful because they sensitize you to things that you might not otherwise see. Okay, and so it gives you a new way of looking at things. And so it's very powerful from the standpoint of policymakers who do need new ways of looking at things. But the question is that all there is? Right? Because I do think that is in fact what sells STS today, is that. But the question is there something more intellectually ambitious or even politically ambitious about STS that goes beyond this kind of, very multiply adaptive instrumentality? Okay? And let me tell you, of course, as we saw with the example of the converging technologies agenda and the way in which we're getting into these new forms of information and communication technology, kind of pervading and invading more and more of society, there is going to be more and more need for STS research because those kinds of arenas are natural arenas for STS people to operate in. Because all of a sudden, actors who otherwise in the past might not have had so much to do with each other, or maybe had their actions regulated in the past, are now kind of in a free space, in a sense, and have to sort of negotiate their identities anew. Okay? So if the government wants to perform surveillance on you under the guise of e-governance, it's going to have to repackage itself a little bit, right? And this is true of all of this other stuff that we're talking about. And STS is very good at getting at all of that kind of thing. But then I go back to the question, is there anything more to it than that? Is there something, because in the beginning, both on the intellectual academic side and on the political side, STS was about kind of renegotiating the social contract of science and technology for society. It had a kind of normative aim, even if the normative position could not be agreed upon. There was this view that we were living with a false self-understanding of science, and that in some way that was inhibiting us democratically or in some other way as a society. And what STS would do was in some sense, liberate us from those false visions, and as a result somehow empower us to kind of harness science and technology to what we might regard as a collectively progressive future. Okay? And that was kind of the big promise of the field, and that's why personally I found the field so attractive. Okay? But I really do think that, given the changes that have taken place in politics and the economy and so forth over the last 30 years or so, that in fact we're in a different space now with STS. But I do think the question still remains, what kind of a thing is STS as we move forward in the future? And I will stop there. Okay? How about that?
Excellent. And we have some time for comments, probably some questions to clarify what Steve was saying. And yes, Ari.
I would like to add one thing to what you're saying, which is that there is a sort of mainstreaming of STS, so that STS approaches are used in quite a number of disciplines nowadays, and sometimes because they found out for themselves, and sometimes because they are inspired by STS, and so you see a little bit of academic turf even appearing. But the key thing, which I think supports your overall thrust of your argument, we're living in an STS world, quite a number of other disciplines, geography,
yes,
anthropology, business studies, is very interesting in this respect. Go on, you can go on,
yes,
but this is some key examples. They also live in an STS world.
That's right.
And so STS is not alone anymore.
That's right.
Sam, thank you. Some more comments? Natalia?
Вот путь СТС к институционализации как научной дисциплины, как, допустим, учебной дисциплины, в общем-то, определяется, конечно, усилиями вот таких вот сообществ и групп, но еще это должно быть кому-то нужно, так сказать, сверху, кто бы был заинтересован это и продвигал, может быть, какие-то тоже должны быть, ну, в определенных, вот в России какие-то государственные решения для того, чтобы это превратилось в какую-то такую научную дисциплину. Но вот как сейчас я понимаю, это действительно вырисовывается такая междисциплинарная область, и в ней, тем не менее, два пути, вот два способа развития, которые могут быть и как отдельные ступени, и как различные модели. То есть это смотря вот как сообщество, которое этим занимается, что выберет. Вот как я тут эксплицирую вот два таких тренда. Один идет, основываясь на каком-то культурном наследии, на интеграции каких-то различных наработок в различных дисциплинах вот, в связи с исследованиями науки, техниками, технологиями. И уже основываясь на этом, интегрируется какое-то новое знание, ну, ищутся инструментарии методологические, при этом осуществляется принцип преемственности в различных категориях, понятий, там, что-то там, и инструментов. То есть идет наработка такого категориально-понятийного каркаса вот этой новой дисциплины. И она, в общем-то, в таком, ну, в классическом русле. А другой способ, и который здесь на конференциях, различных докладах у нас проявлялся, тоже очень интересный, это, и он, кстати, из истории СТС может быть эксплицирован, это когда намеренно идет как бы отрыв от традиции, ну, специальное такое, как методологическое усилие, ну, для некоторых, может, это не методологическое усилие, просто там они как бы с чистого листа приходят в эту сферу, для некоторых это методологическое усилие, чтобы осуществить какой-то разрыв с традициями, с различными методами, методологиями, знаниями. Вот Андрей как раз об этом тоже говорил, многие авторы. И вот с чистого листа как бы пытаться что-то вот набрасывать какие-то идеи для того, чтобы вот в этом котле варилась вот эта какая-то новое знание. Ну вот, на мой взгляд, если вот эти два пути будут слишком разниться, то есть вот такой вот агрессивный, так сказать, способ и более такой цивилизованный, они должны все равно потом каким-то образом соединяться, чтобы вот эта дисциплина получилась. Но на стадии развития дисциплины это, конечно, вот такие модели, они вполне приемлемы, и они дают вот этот стимул это своеобразный мозговой штурм, вот второй путь, когда, допустим, мы оказываемся в пустом пространстве, как будто мы не знаем никаких других философских, социологических и других концепций, и вот мы начинаем якобы что-то изобретать. А другие критики, они уже смотрят, как это вписать в контекст науки, вообще вот эту дисциплину, что там получается. Мне кажется, вот это такой вот путь вот я вижу. Ну и проблемы отсюда возникают.
Спасибо, спасибо, Иван.
Can I respond to this directly? Or no?
Okay. Yeah. Because you are.
Yes. I think one thing that's kind of interesting about institutionalizing STS is that if you look at sort of a non-Western place, so some place like Japan and some of the East Asian places which actually have STS communities. One of the things, and this is certainly true in the case of Japan, that there was initially a lot of concern that, well, there was this belief that by understanding aspects of the way science and technology had developed in Japan, that the Japanese people, policymakers, the public, would get a clearer sense of why things went well when they did and why they didn't when they didn't. And in that respect, then, it could be part of a kind of cultural conversation in a sense. Okay, now this is in a context where history is very much part of how STS got founded in Japan. I think that's a very important point. And a lot of it was very much focused on, you know, the role of the World War II experience and the aftermath, and the various sorts of groups jockeying around to determine the course of science in Japan. But there, I think, you do actually see a lot of active discussion where this issue of how it could have been otherwise and what the consequences would have been actually is very much part of the discussion, and it has this kind of cultural quality to it, okay? And part of the strategy there, and I think this goes to a decision I think that people here and maybe elsewhere in Russia need to make, is whether there are two ways you can kind of get into the STS worldwide community. One way is simply to blend in, right? You know, kind of be like what we do in Britain or France or the Netherlands or whatever, and be able to travel around a lot and be kind of almost replaceable with people from those places. Because you're doing pretty much the same thing as they're doing. And so then your departments would get a very good reputation for training people who work well in Western settings, right? But there's not necessarily, and there's a market for that, you might say. There is a kind of market for that. But what you don't necessarily get is any kind of real intellectual innovation coming. At least it's not obvious there's an incentive for intellectual innovation under those circumstances. Now the Japanese went their own way on this. And if you look at a lot of there is this East Asia Journal of STS, which the Japanese founded. And if you look at the initial issue, there's a lot of boundary maintenance. Let's put where we do it differently, and we've got these issues that we're concerned about, and we're going to, as it were, make the world pay attention to our issues, which we think actually have greater relevance, but they start here. Okay? And they have a lot of people doing STS in that part of the world. They haven't yet made that much impact on the larger global scene, but they're developing a very distinctive kind of approach. And I do think that this is something that you might want to think about in terms of how you conceptualize, the institutionalization of the field.
Oh, thank you. Ivan?
I want to both somehow to soften a little bit this pathos, and to say that we should recognize one of the weaknesses of STS, that it is still not well disciplinary established, and somehow this made problems, especially in rigid scientific councils. Concerning to funding, because I'm not in Netherlands or some other country, but especially in our part of the world, when you have discipline, sociology, philosophy, and going with STS project in its and sometimes it makes problem, because different lobbies, they don't know how to identify you very often you're kicking off. And it's also in the university setting, because you are neither philosopher nor sociologist, no natural sciences. So this is one of the problems in STS. I have to say, one of the trauma we have to bear with us for the pleasure to stay in STS. But on the other hand, I will not completely agree, although you're right that we are not like Marxism, very heavy theoretical. But for me, from the very beginning, one of the charm of STS was that it is also heavily philosophical loaded, but not for the philosophy by itself. I want to mention the Gerard de Vries article about the importance of Wittgenstein on classical sociology, scientific knowledge.
Sure.
And if you take actual network theory itself, it is made profound. And many other STS scholars, for me personally, a paper on the mounted reality is still one of the very important issues that I'm still thinking in. And now, even today, last few years, we have this speculative philosophy, object-oriented philosophy movement, which is coming out of the critical literature. I mean, authors like Granam and Mayes, and some other. It's also challenging and provide a new breadth of our deeper philosophical ground. What I mean that in order to do STS efficiently, you have to be really philosophically enlightened. You have to go much deeper in philosophy, not for the philosophy itself, but on the sake of your empirical research. So this is also one of the very distinct points of STS, in my point of view.
Can I respond to that?
Very briefly,
Okay.
because, друзья, STS in Tomsk, and it's done, and it was great. Thank you very much.